The heat in the studio was thick, suffocating, and dripping with an unholy, breathless craving. Akua's mahogany skin glistened under the low amber lights, her fingers slick with wet clay, but her mind was entirely consumed by the towering shadow standing behind her. Kangdae's muscular, tattoo-clad arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her hips flush against his rock-hard thighs. His hot breath brushed her neck, sending a shiver of pure, addictive pleasure down her spine. She gasped, arching into his dominance, completely ruined by the touch of Seoul's most dangerous air. She was his captive, and she loved it. Every single second in this secluded, high-tech studio felt like a beautifully orchestrated torment. Akua was a 22-year-old rising star from Accra, Ghana, possessing a rare, breathtaking beauty that was as sharp and striking as the marble she carved. Her full, pillowy lips, deep-set, expressive dark eyes, and a body defined by intoxicating, sweeping curves made her a vision that stood out in the sleek, minimalist landscape of Seoul. She had come to the bustling South Korean capital on what she believed was the opportunity of a lifetime. A prestigious, private artistic residency funded by an anonymous, ultra-wealthy patron. She had envisioned weeks of quiet dedication, molding clay, carving stone, and letting her soul speak through her art. Instead, she had been delivered directly into the jaws of a predator who had no intention of letting her go. Kangdae was 28 years of sheer, unadulterated power. Standing well over 6 feet tall, his body was a masterclass in physical perfection, boasting broad, heavy shoulders, a deeply defined chest, and a tapered waist that hinted at lethal athletic agility. But it was his skin that truly captivated and terrified Akua. Intricate, dark, and sprawling tattoos covered almost every inch of his muscular frame, winding like ink-stained ivy up his thick neck, across his collarbones, and down his massive arms. These were not mere decorations. They were the visual history of a ruthless underworld legacy. A legacy that he carried with a cold, aristocratic arrogance that made men tremble and made Akua's knees go entirely weak. He was the sole heir to one of the most powerful and feared syndicates in East Asia, a man whose name was whispered in the highest corporate boardrooms and the darkest back alleys of Seoul with equal parts reverence and dread. From the moment Kangdae had walked into her studio on her first night, the atmosphere had shifted from artistic sanctuary to a high-stakes arena of desire. He didn't just look at her. He devoured her with a dark, obsidian gaze that seemed to strip away her clothes, her defenses, and her very sanity. He had walked slow, deliberate circles around her, the heavy scent of sandalwood, expensive leather, and raw, masculine heat filling the room, pushing out the dusty smell of dry plaster. Akua had tried to maintain her professional composure, holding her sculpting tool like a shield, but the sheer gravity of his presence had anchored her to the floor. That first night, he had stepped so close that she could feel the radiating warmth of his chest against her bare shoulder. Without a single word, he had reached out, his large, calloused hand, veins standing out against the dark ink of a roaring tiger wrapping around his wrist, gently but firmly taking her chin. He had tilted her face up, forcing her to look into eyes that promised both absolute ruin and unimaginable ecstasy. His thumb, rough and warm, had traced the plush curve of her lower lip, smearing a trace of white clay across her rich, dark skin. It was an act of pure possession, a silent declaration that she now belonged to his world. Since then, the studio had become a golden cage. Akua quickly realized that her residency was not a celebration of her talent, but a highly calculated entrapment. Kangdae visited her every night, always after the city lights had flickered to life and the rest of the building was deserted. He would strip off his expensive, tailored suit jackets, rolling up his sleeves to reveal those massive, tattooed forearms, and watch her work for hours. The sheer intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, a constant, silent pressure that made her skin tingle and her heart hammer against her ribs. But it was the way he participated in her art that truly undid her. Kangdae did not merely observe. He demanded to touch. He would stand behind her, his chest pressed flat against her back, his heavy, muscular frame completely enveloping her smaller, cavia one. He would guide her hands, his large, warm fingers wrapping over her clay-slicked ones, forcing her to mold the wet medium under his direction. The sensation of his hard, tattooed body moving in perfect, agonizingly slow rhythm with hers was an intoxicating torture. Every brush of his chest against her shoulder blades, every slide of his hips against her backside, sent waves of heat pooling deep in her core. She found herself panting, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as they worked the clay together, their movements mirroring a much more intimate primal dance. As the days bled into weeks, a darker, more dangerous reality began to unravel beneath the surface of this obsessive passion. Acua began to notice that the specific shapes and figures Kangdae forced her to sculpt were far from random. He had her creating intricate, abstract monuments. Human figures locked in agonizing embraces, hands reaching out from cracked earth, and jagged, weeping faces. Initially, she believed it was just his dark, brooding aesthetic. But one night, while cleaning the studio after he had left, she discovered a hidden drawer in his private lounge adjacent to the workspace. Inside lay a ledger filled with names, coordinates, and photographs of prominent figures in Seoul's criminal underworld, alongside sketches of her own sculptures. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and trembling. The sculptures she was creating with such painstaking devotion were not destined for galleries. They were being used as sinister, highly coded messages. Kangdae was using the unique, unmistakable style of her art to send silent, chilling threats to his rivals. A specific curve of a clay torso signified a boundary crossed. A jagged, fractured base represented a promise of total destruction. Her delicate, artistic hands were being forced to forge the physical manifestations of his violent, bloody legacy. She was not just his muse. She was his accomplice, her beloved art weaponized in a deadly war for territorial dominance. The terror of this realization should have made her run, should have made her scream for help or plot her escape. But the trap was already shut, and the bait was far too addictive. When Kangdae returned that very night, the air between them was charged with a volatile, electric tension that threatened to combust at any second. He could see the fear and the sudden, sharp understanding in her eyes. He didn't deny it. Instead, he locked the heavy steel doors of the studio, the metallic click echoing like a death knell through the cavernous space. He walked toward her, slowly unbuttoning his black silk shirt, letting it slide off his massive, sculpted shoulders to pool on the floor. Acua's breath caught in her throat. His bare chest was a breathtaking sight of rugged, hyper-masculine beauty, the dark ink of a sprawling dragon wrapping around his left pectoral, its tail descending down his flat, rippling abdomen. He was a creature of pure, lethal power, and yet, the sight of him filled her with a desperate, aching hunger that defied all logic. If your heart is racing and you can feel the absolute heat radiating from this forbidden, high-stakes touch, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about how you would handle Kangdae's dark, possessive gaze, and share this story with someone who loves a dangerously seductive thrill. He backed her up against the sturdy wooden sculpting table, her thighs pressing against the edge, trapping her between his imposing body and the cold, wet clay of her latest creation. Acua looked up at him, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and overwhelming desire. "You're using me?" she whispered, her voice trembling, though she couldn't tear her gaze away from his plush, parted lips. "My hands, my art. It's all a message of death for your enemies." Kangdae leaned in, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes burning with an obsessive, untamed fire. "Your hands are meant for creation, Acua," he growled, his deep, baritone voice vibrating through her very bones. "But in my world, creation and destruction are the same thing. You sculpt my thoughts, you mold my desires, and right now, my only desire is you." He didn't wait for her to respond. His mouth descended upon hers with a fierce, hungry possessiveness that completely wiped out her ability to think. It was a kiss born of pure, unadulterated passion and dangerous dominance. He tasted of dark liquor and mint, his tongue tangling with hers in a demanding, breathless rhythm that left her completely lightheaded. Acua groaned, her hands automatically flying to his bare shoulders, her fingers digging into the firm, tattooed muscle, feeling the incredible power flexing beneath his skin. She was completely lost in the sensation of him. He lifted her easily, placing her onto the edge of the table, his large hands sliding up her bare, smooth thighs, pulling her legs around his waist. The contrast of her deep mahogany skin against his pale, heavily tattooed thighs was a visual masterpiece, a striking display of contrast and raw, magnetic attraction. He pressed his body hard against hers, the friction of their clothes generating an intense, unbearable heat that made her writhe beneath him. "Tell me to stop," Kangdae whispered against her lips, his breath hot and ragged as he trailed kisses down her jawline, his teeth gently grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. "Tell me to let you go, Acua. Tell me you want to leave this cage." But she couldn't. She was completely, utterly enslaved by the pleasure of his touch, addicted to the danger that rolled off him in waves. She wrapped her arms tighter around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, inhaling his intoxicating scent. "Don't stop," she whimpered, her voice a breathless, submissive plea that only fueled his possessive fire. "Just mold me." Kangdae let out a low, victorious growl, his hands gripping her hips with a bruising force that promised she would never, ever be free of him. He began to move against her, a slow, agonizingly seductive rhythm that drove them both to the absolute brink of sanity. Every touch was a promise of danger, every gasp a surrender to the dark, beautiful vengeance that bound them together. In the dim light of the Soul Studio, surrounded by cold clay and the heavy whispers of the underworld, the Ghanaian sculptress and the dangerous air became one, lost in a storm of obsessive passion where the line between captive and captor was forever erased. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Soul Studio did nothing to cool the simmering, liquid heat that lingered in the air. Acua awoke draped across the plush leather sofa, her body aching in the most delicious, intoxicating way. Her skin still felt hypersensitive, tingling with the phantom memory of Kangdae's heavy, tattooed hands tracing every single curve of her waist and hips. He was gone, leaving only the faint, intoxicating scent of his expensive tobacco and raw masculinity lingering on her skin, and a brand new, massive slab of unworked, gray clay resting in the center of the room. Beside the clay lay a sleek, obsidian envelope. With trembling fingers, Acua opened it, finding a single, handwritten note in elegant, sharp Korean script that she had learned to decipher. Asterisk, the final piece begins tonight. Shape my wrath. Asterisk. When darkness fell over the glittering, neon-drenched skyline of Seoul, the heavy steel doors groaned open once more. Kangdae stepped into the room, looking every bit the lethal aristocrat. He wore a tailored, midnight black suit, but the top 3 buttons of his shirt were left undone, revealing the dark, winding tails of the dragon tattoo creeping up his throat. His eyes, dark and predatory, immediately locked onto Acua. She was standing by the new slab of clay, wearing a simple, form-fitting silk slip that clung to her deep mahogany curves, her hair cascading over her shoulders. The contrast between them, her soft, radiant warmth and his cold, dangerous edge, was a visual friction that instantly set the room on fire. He didn't say a word as he walked across the polished concrete floor, his heavy leather boots clicking rhythmically, a sound that made Acua's heart flutter with a dangerous, submissive thrill. He stopped just inches from her, his massive chest rising and falling, his gaze dropping to her lips before raking down her entire body. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, a suffocating wave of pure, unadulterated desire that made Acua's breath hitch. He reached out, his thick, tattooed fingers sliding into her hair, gripping the back of her head with a gentle but unyielding force that tilted her face up to his. "Do you know what we are creating tonight, my beautiful little sculptress?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a direct jolt of pleasure straight to her core. Acua shook her head, her eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnetism of his presence. "Tell me," she breathed, her hands instinctively rising to rest against his broad chest, feeling the rapid, heavy thud of his heart. Kangdae leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear, his hot breath making her shiver. "Tonight you mold the end of the Beck clan. For 10 years, they have bled my family in the shadows. They took my older brother. They thought they buried the legacy. But tonight, at the Grand Underworld Tribunal, I will present them with a gift. Your masterpiece, a sculpture of a fallen angel, its wings torn, its throat crushed by a tiger's claw. When they see your specific, unmistakable handiwork, they will know it is a declaration of total, merciless war. Your beautiful hands are going to sign their death warrants. The sheer gravity of his words sent a wave of absolute terror through her, but it was inextricably tangled with an overwhelming, dark ecstasy. She was being pulled into the very heart of a blood feud, transformed into the artistic executioner for Seoul's most dangerous heir. The danger lurking just outside the studio doors. The black sedans, the armed guards, the whispers of violence, faded into a jagged reality that only served to make the sanctuary of his touch feel more urgent, more desperately vital. Before she could process the danger, Kang Dae stripped off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his shirt completely, letting the fabric drop to the floor. His bare torso was a breathtaking monument of physical perfection, a tapestry of rippling muscle and dark, intricate ink that told stories of survival and dominance. He stepped behind her, wrapping his massive, tattooed arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his rock-hard abdomen. He guided her toward the wet clay, his large, warm hands covering hers, slicking them with water. If this intense, intoxicating collision of dark vengeance and pure, obsessive passion has you completely hooked and eager to see how far this dangerous game goes, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment with your thoughts on Akua's thrilling predicament, and share this video with everyone who craves a breathless, high-stakes story. Together, their bodies began to move in a slow, agonizingly seductive rhythm against the massive block of clay. Kang Dae used his immense physical strength to dictate her movements, his chest pressing hard against her back, his hips grinding into hers with a possessive, heavy friction that made her moan aloud. Every time her fingers sank into the cool, responsive clay, his tattooed grip would tighten, guiding her to shape the jagged, violent edges of the monument. He was molding the clay through her, but more than that, he was molding her. He was transforming her from an innocent artist into a creature completely bound to his dark, vengeful soul. The contrast in the room was almost too much to bear. There was the delicate, breathtaking beauty of Akua's sculpted curves, glowing under the dim amber studio lights, and then there was the raw, jagged reality of the lethal message they were forging. Kang Dae's breath grew more ragged, his lips tracing a path of burning kisses along her shoulder blade, his teeth gently nipping at her skin, marking her as his over and over again. Akua arched her back into his touch, her eyes closing as a wave of pure, addictive pleasure washed over her. She was entirely undone, ruined by the sheer dominance of a man who held the city in his hands, yet chose to spend his nights consuming her very existence. "You are mine, Akua," he growled against her skin, his hands sliding down her thighs, lifting her silk slip to feel the bare warmth of her skin against his tattooed fingers. "Every curve you shape, every breath you take in this room, belongs to me. We are going to burn this city down, and you are going to carve the ashes." She couldn't speak. She could only surrender to the storm of desire that bound them together. In the quiet intensity of the Seoul night, as the clay took the shape of a terrifying, beautiful promise of destruction, the Ghanaian sculptress realized she never wanted to escape her gilded cage. The rain began to hammer against the high glass windows of the studio, a relentless, heavy downpour that mirrored the chaotic storm raging inside Akua's chest. The city of Seoul outside became a blurred, glittering watercolor of neon pinks and blues, completely cut off from the dark, intimate sanctuary where she was being systematically undone. Every slide of Kang Dae's slick, tattooed chest against her bare back felt like a brand, marking her as his in a way that she knew she could never wash off. Her fingers, heavy with gray clay, trembled as she molded the jagged, broken wing of the fallen angel, her breath catching as his large hands slid down to grip her waist with bruising intensity. He was so close she could hear the dark, rhythmic purr of his breathing, a sound that seemed to synchronize with her own racing heartbeat. The contrast of his cold, calculated world and her soft, expressive artistry had completely dissolved. She was no longer just a sculptress. She was the living vessel through which his dark vengeance was taking physical form. With every stroke of her fingers, she was breathing life into a threat that would soon shake the foundation of the city's criminal empire. Yet the only thing she could focus on was the agonizingly sweet pressure of his body pinning her against the wooden table. Kang Dae leaned over her shoulder, his chin resting against the curve of her neck as he watched her work, his eyes dark with a mixture of artistic appreciation and raw, carnal hunger. The heat radiating from his massive, muscular frame was a physical force, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. His tattoos, the intricate dragon scales, the swirling waves, the sharp, defensive thorns, seemed to come alive in the flickering amber light of the studio, moving across his flexing muscles as he shifted his weight. "You're shaking, Acua," he whispered, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated directly against her collarbone. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin just below her ear, making her gasp and arch her back, her fingers slipping and leaving a deep gouge in the wet clay. "Is it the cold of the clay? Or are you finally realizing how deep you've fallen into my world?" She let out a soft, defeated sigh, her head falling back against his solid chest. "You've ruined me, Kangdae," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper against the drumming of the rain. "I came here to create beauty, and now I'm carving a message of war. How am I supposed to go back to my life after this? How am I supposed to pretend my hands didn't shape the end of a dynasty?" Kangdae's grip on her waist tightened, his fingers digging into her soft skin with a possessive urgency that made her blood run hot. He turned her around slowly, forcing her to face him. The sheer sight of him, his chiseled chest glistening with a light sheen of sweat, his dark hair damp and messy, and his intense, obsidian eyes locked onto hers, made her knees buckle. He caught her easily, lifting her up so she was sitting on the edge of the high sculpting table, her legs naturally wrapping around his waist to lock him close. He looked up at her, his face a mask of fierce, unyielding devotion. "There is no going back, Acua. The moment you let my ink touch your skin, the moment you let me taste you, your old life ended. You are the heart of my empire now. They think I am the monster of soul, but they don't know that my soul is bound to the girl who shapes clay in the dark." He reached out, his hand wet with water from the sculpting bucket, and gently ran his fingers down her neck, leaving a cool, tingling trail that contrasted sharply with the burning heat of her skin. He traced the sweeping line of her collarbone, his touch so light, so agonizingly slow, that it felt like a silent torment. He was worshipping her, treating her body like the most precious masterpiece he had ever laid eyes on, and the sheer pleasure of his undivided attention was a drug she couldn't get enough of. If you are completely consumed by this dark, addictive romance and want to see if Acua can survive the crossfire of Soul's underworld, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, drop a comment with your favorite moments so far, and share this video with fellow romance lovers. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a teasing, feather-light torment that made her whine with frustration. She wanted the fire of his kiss, the demanding, breathless hunger that usually consumed them, but he was playing with her, stretching the anticipation until she was completely at his mercy. His hands slid down to her thighs, parting them wider, his fingers tracing the soft, sensitive skin of her inner thighs, sending waves of pure, electric ecstasy straight to her core. "Please, Kangdae," she whimpered, her hands gripping his broad shoulders, her fingernails digging into the firm, tattooed muscle of his back. "Don't play with me." A dark, dangerous smile played on his lips, his eyes flashing with absolute triumph. "I'm not playing, my beautiful girl. I am showing you exactly who owns you." He captured her mouth then, a deep, bruising kiss that stole the very air from her lungs. It was a chaotic collision of passion and power, his tongue sweeping into her mouth with a dominant, possessive hunger that demanded complete surrender. Acua clung to him like a drowning person, her body vibrating with a wild, untamed pleasure that made her forget the danger, forget the rain, and forget the dark legacy they were forging. She was entirely his, molded by his hands, lost in a gilded cage of her own making, and as his heavy, muscular frame pressed her flat against the wooden table, she knew she would gladly burn in his fire forever. The wooden table groaned under their shifting weight as the raw, unbridled tempest of their passion reached a fever pitch. Kangdae's movements were deliberate, heavy, and utterly intoxicating, driving Acua to the absolute edge of sensory overload. Every single press of his hard, tattooed chest against her sensitive breasts sent ripples of electric heat cascading through her veins. She clung to his massive shoulders, her fingers slipping against the light sheen of sweat coating his skin, her breath escaping in desperate, high-pitched whimpers that only seemed to fuel his primal, possessive drive. The world outside the studio, the rain, the looming threat of the underworld, the dangerous secrets of the Beck clan, completely evaporated, leaving only the white-hot orbit of his touch. He was her absolute master in this space, guiding her through a labyrinth of pure, obsessive pleasure until they both shattered, clinging to one another in a breathless, trembling embrace as the storm outside slowly began to subside. For several minutes, the only sound in the cavernous room was the ragged, synchronized rise and fall of their breathing. Kang Dae kept her pressed tightly against him, his large, tattooed arms acting as an unbreakable vice, sheltering her from the cold air of the studio. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet, earthy scent of her skin mixed with the sharp aroma of wet clay. Akua ran her fingers gently through his damp, dark hair, feeling the heavy, powerful pulse in his neck. She had never felt so utterly consumed, so completely stripped of her defenses, yet so fiercely protected. Slowly, Kang Dae lifted his head, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them, though still carrying that deep, smoldering intensity that made her heart skip a beat. Without a word, he slid his arms under her knees and back, lifting her easily from the table. Akua gasped softly, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her across the studio toward the private, luxury bath area hidden behind a screen of frosted glass. The steam rose instantly as he turned on the rainfall shower, filling the marble space with a warm, comforting mist. Kang Dae stepped under the spray, letting the warm water wash over both of them. He set her down gently on her feet, but his hands never left her waist. The water cascaded over his broad, muscular shoulders, tracing the dark, intricate lines of the dragon and tiger tattoos that wrapped around his torso, making the ink look glossy and alive. With slow, agonizingly sensual movements, he picked up a bar of expensive, sandalwood-scented soap, lathering it between his massive hands. He began to wash her, his touch a breathtaking contrast of raw strength and exquisite gentleness. He ran his soapy hands down her neck, over her collarbones, and across her full, heavy breasts, washing away the traces of gray clay that had dried on her skin. Akua closed her eyes, tilting her head back under the spray, letting out a soft, purring moan as his rough, calloused palms glided over her soft, mahogany curves. He moved down to her waist, his thumbs tracing the deep indents of her hips, before sliding over her round, smooth thighs. Every stroke of his hands was an act of pure worship, a silent declaration that every inch of her stunning body belonged to him, to protect, to cherish, and to ruin at his leisure. By the time he finished rinsing her off, Akua was leaning heavily against the warm marble wall, her body completely relaxed, her skin glowing and hypersensitive from his touch. Kang Dae shut off the water and wrapped her in a plush, oversized black towel, drying her with a tenderness that defied his lethal reputation. He wrapped a matching towel around his own waist, his bare, tattooed torso still glistening with droplets of water. If this incredibly sensual, high-stakes journey into the heart of Soul's dark desires has you completely spellbound, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a passionate comment about Akua and Kang Dae's undeniable chemistry, and share this story with someone who loves a thrilling, breathless escape. They walked back into the main studio space, the cool air striking their warm skin. In the center of the room, the sculpture of the fallen angel stood completed, its terrifying, beautiful form cast in the dim amber light. The wings were jagged and torn, the throat crushed by a perfectly rendered tiger's claw, the unmistakable, lethal signature of Kang Dae's family. It was a masterpiece of pure vengeance, a physical manifestation of the war that was about to consume the city. Kang Dae stood before it, his expression hardening back into the cold, calculated mask of the syndicate heir. Yet, as he looked from the clay monument to Akua, who stood beside him wrapped in her black towel, his eyes softened with an obsessive pride. "It is perfect," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "The Beck clan will look at this, and they will see their own graves. They will know that the tiger has returned to claim his territory." He stepped closer to her, cupping her face in his large, warm hand, his thumb tracing her full, dark lips. And they will know that the hand that carved their doom belongs to the woman who rules my heart. Before Acua could answer, the sharp, heavy sound of a buzzer echoed through the studio, shattering the quiet sanctuary they had built. The security monitors on the wall flickered to life, showing 3 sleek, black sedans idling in the rain-slicked alleyway below. Several tall men in dark suits stood waiting, their faces grim and alert. The real world was knocking at the door. The tribunal was tonight, and the message of war was ready to be delivered. Acua felt a sudden, sharp coldness wash over her, a reminder of the dangerous reality she was now permanently bound to. She looked at Kangdae, her eyes wide with a silent, pleading question. Kangdae didn't flinch. He leaned down, pressing a hard, reassuring kiss to her lips, tasting of clean water and lingering passion. "Stay here," he ordered softly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "My men will guard this door. When I return, the city will be ours." The heavy steel doors clicked shut with a definitive, chilling sound, leaving Acua alone in the vast, silent studio. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the thrumming, electric heat that had filled the space just moments before. She walked over to the window, wrapping the plush black towel tighter around her body, her eyes tracking the 3 black sedans as they glided away into the dark, rain-swept streets of Seoul. She could still feel the lingering burn of Kangdae's parting kiss on her lips, a taste of metallic adrenaline and sweet mint that made her mouth water with a desperate, aching longing. He was stepping into a den of wolves, carrying her masterfully sculpted declaration of war, and she was left behind with nothing but her racing thoughts and the phantom sensations of his touch. For hours, Acua paced the polished concrete floor, her bare feet making soft, whispering sounds in the dark. She tried to distract herself by cleaning the sculpting tools, but every object she touched reminded her of him. The scraping tools reminded her of the way his rough, calloused hands had guided hers. The spray bottle reminded her of the cool mist he had settled over her skin. The heavy wooden table still held the faint indentation of their locked bodies. The raw, obsessive passion he had ignited in her was a fever that wouldn't break. She was completely, utterly enslaved by the memory of his heavy, tattooed frame pressing her down, his dark eyes looking into her soul with a hunger that was both terrifying and utterly validating. She had never felt so alive, so dangerously desired, as she did when she was locked in his embrace. As midnight came and went, the suspense became almost physically painful. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and twist, mimicking the jagged curves of the fallen angel sculpture they had birthed together. She found herself standing before the empty pedestal where the masterpiece had rested, her fingers tracing the air where the clay had been. She realized, with a sudden, breathless shock, that she didn't care about the danger anymore. She didn't care about the underworld, the rival clans, or the blood legacy that Kangdae carried. She only cared about him. She wanted his touch, his voice, his heavy body pinning her down until she couldn't breathe. She was no longer just a victim of his seductive vengeance. She was a willing participant in her own beautiful ruin. Suddenly, the security monitors on the wall flickered. The bright, high-definition screens showed a single, sleek black sedan pulling into the alleyway. The car doors didn't open immediately, and Acua's heart hammered a frantic, agonizing rhythm against her ribs. She held her breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her towel as she stared at the screen. Finally, the driver's side door opened, and a tall, familiar figure stepped out into the pouring rain. It was Kangdae. He didn't have his suit jacket on. His black silk shirt was completely unbuttoned, clinging damply to his massive, muscular chest, revealing the dark, winding ink of the dragon stretching across his torso. He looked up toward the camera, his dark eyes burning through the lens, a fierce, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He was alive. He had won. If you can feel the absolute, breathless tension of this moment and are dying to know what happens when Kangdae walks back through those studio doors, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment sharing your wildest theory about how the Baek clan reacted to Acua's sculpture, and share this video with everyone who loves a dangerously passionate thrill. The heavy steel doors groaned open, and a rush of cold, rain-scented air swept into the warm studio, followed immediately by the towering, dominant presence of Seoul's most dangerous heir. Kangdae stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a loud, echoey slam that made Akua jump. He stood there for a moment, dripping wet, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon, his long, dark hair plastered against his forehead. He looked wild, predatory, and incredibly handsome. There was a faint smudge of dark soot on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were raw and red, but his eyes were locked entirely on Akua. Without a single word, he strode across the room, his heavy boots leaving wet prints on the concrete floor. The sheer momentum of his approach took her breath away. Before she could speak, he reached her, his large, damp hands grabbing her waist with a fierce, desperate intensity that pulled her off her feet. He slammed her back gently against the nearest wall, his massive, warm body pinning her flat. Akua let out a soft gasp, her hands instantly flying to his wet, naked chest, feeling the wild, erratic throb of his heart and the hard, flexing muscles beneath her palms. "It's done," he growled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a violent shiver of pure, addictive pleasure straight down her spine. He leaned in, his hot, heavy breath brushing against her lips, making her whimper with a craving that was almost painful. They saw the sculpture Akua. The moment they realized the level of detail, the sheer message of death carved into the clay, they knew they had lost. The Beck clan has surrendered. Their territory, their power, it all belongs to me now. "And what about us?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up into his dark, obsessive eyes, her body completely melting against his hard, tattooed frame. "What happens to your sculptress now, Kangdae?" Kangdae's gaze darkened with a raw, primal hunger that made her entire body throb with anticipation. He grabbed the knot of the towel wrapped around her chest, slowly pulling it loose, letting the heavy fabric slide down her smooth, mahogany skin to pool on the floor between them. He looked down at her bare, breathtaking curves, his hand rising to cup her breast, his thumb tracing the hard, dark peak with a possessive, agonizing friction that made her moan aloud, her head falling back against the wall. "You are never leaving this room, Akua," he whispered against her lips, his fingers sliding down to grip her hip, tilting her body up to meet his. "You are my queen, my muse, my beautiful captive creator. And tonight, I am going to make you forget there was ever a world outside these walls." His mouth descended upon hers with a raw, ravenous hunger that seemed to pull the very soul from her body. The kiss was not a gentle reassurance. It was a victory march, a demanding claim of absolute ownership that left Akua completely breathless and clinging to his damp, solid shoulders for dear life. Her bare mahogany skin tingled against the cool concrete wall, but the front of her body was melting into the sheer, radiating furnace of his muscular, tattooed frame. She groaned into his mouth, her fingers tangling desperately in his wet, dark hair, pulling him closer, wanting to dissolve into his very skin. With a low, possessive growl, Kangdae swept her up into his massive arms once more, carrying her away from the wall and toward the elevated velvet-draped platform in the center of the room. He laid her down with an exquisite, slow-burning reverence, as if she were the most precious masterpiece he had ever laid his hands upon. In the dim, amber glow of the studio lights, her sweeping curves shone like polished obsidian, a striking, breathtaking contrast against the deep crimson velvet beneath her. He climbed over her, his heavy, muscular frame completely overshadowing her smaller, delicate body. The intricate tattoos winding across his chest and arms seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the shadows, tracing the hard lines of his abs and the powerful breadth of his shoulders. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with an obsessive, untamed fire that made her entire body throb with a desperate, aching anticipation. "You are my masterpiece, Akua," he whispered, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that sent shivers of pure, liquid heat straight to her core. "The city is mine, but I am entirely yours." His hands, large and warm, began a slow, agonizingly seductive exploration of her body. He traced the smooth line of her throat, his thumbs gently pressing against her racing pulse, before sliding down to her collarbones and cupping the heavy, aching fullness of her breasts. Akua arched her back with a soft, pleading whimper, her eyes closing as a wave of intense, pleasure-driven ecstasy washed over her. Every single touch of his rough, calloused fingers was a masterclass in sensory torment, driving her closer and closer to the edge of absolute madness. He leaned down, his lips trailing hot, burning paths over her chest, his tongue teasing the sensitive skin of her stomach, making her muscles contract sharply in response. She writhed beneath him, her hands reaching out to grip his massive biceps, feeling the incredible, coiled power flexing beneath his ink-stained skin. The sheer contrast of their bodies, her rich, dark warmth and his pale, heavily tattooed strength, was a visual display of pure, unadulterated passion that made the very air in the room feel thick and suffocating. If you were completely swept away by the sheer heat and dark, intoxicating romance of Acua and Kangdae's forbidden union, make sure to show some love by subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button, dropping a comment about your favorite part of this wild ride, and sharing this story with your friends. Their bodies moved together in a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly intense dance of surrender. Kangdae's dominance was absolute, yet he moved with a tender, protective urgency that made her feel like the center of his entire universe. Every gasp of her breath, every soft cry that escaped her lips, was met with a deeper, more passionate claim from him. They were locked in a storm of their own making, a beautiful, chaotic collision of two entirely different worlds that had found their perfect, dangerous harmony in the dark. When the storm finally subsided, leaving them both breathless, tangled, and glistening with a light sheen of sweat, the quietness of the room returned. The rain outside had completely stopped, leaving only the distant, muffled hum of the Seoul metropolis below. Kangdae pulled her tight against his chest, his large hand gently stroking her hair as she rested her head over his heart, listening to its steady, powerful thud. The morning light would soon rise over the city, bringing with it the news of a fallen empire and the rise of a new, undisputed king. But in the quiet sanctuary of the studio, the dangerous heir and his beautiful sculptress remained locked in their gilded cage, completely consumed by an obsessive passion that had rewritten their destinies forever. The pale, lavender light of dawn slowly filtered through the high glass panes, casting long, elegant shadows across the studio floor and painting their tangled bodies in hues of soft blue and gold. Acua stirred, her eyelashes fluttering against the soft fabric of the velvet pillows. She felt the heavy, comforting weight of Kangdae's massive arm draped possessively over her waist. His thick, tattooed fingers curled slightly against her hip as if even in his sleep, he was anchoring her to him. The warmth radiating from his large, muscular chest was a protective barrier against the cool morning air, a reminder of the wild, unbridled tempest that had consumed them both throughout the night. She lay still, listening to the deep, steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that had quickly become the only anchor she needed in this chaotic, dangerous city. Slowly, as if sensing her shift in awareness, Kangdae's grip tightened. A low, gravelly rumble vibrated deep within his chest, and he pulled her flush against him, his face burying in the soft, fragrant cloud of her dark hair. Acua let out a soft, trembling sigh, her skin tingling at the sudden, delicious friction of his bare, tattooed thighs sliding against hers. He was awake now, his dark eyes opening to look down at her with a fierce, burning intensity that had not dimmed in the slightest. "You're thinking too much, my beautiful girl," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, a rough, lazy baritone that sent a direct wave of pleasure straight to her core. He leaned down, his lips tracing a slow, warm path along her jawline before capturing her lower lip in a soft, lingering bite that made her gasp. "Your mind is running, but your body belongs right here, under me. The city is going to wake up soon, Kangdae," she whispered back, though she couldn't help but arch her neck, inviting the burning path of his kisses down to her collarbone. Her hands rose to rest on his broad, muscular shoulders, her fingers tracing the dark, raised lines of the dragon scales that wrapped around his collarbone. "They are going to realize what happened last night. Your name, my art. Everything has changed." Kangdae let out a dark, soft chuckle, his hands sliding down her back, tracing the smooth, delicate curve of her spine with an agonizing slowness that made her writhing beneath him. "Let them realize. Let them tremble. They know now that the tiger does not hunt alone. They know that the hands that shaped their downfall are protected by a force they can never touch." He lifted himself up slightly, his massive chest hovering over her, his eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, untamed pride that made her breath hitch. You are not just my sculptress anymore, Acua. You are the shadow that rules the throne, and I will burn anyone who even dares to look at your creations with anything less than absolute reverence. The sheer intensity of his devotion was a dizzying, suffocating force, a golden cage that she had no desire to escape. He leaned down, his mouth catching hers in a deep, slow, and incredibly sensual kiss that tasted of clean rain and raw, lingering desire. His hands, warm and heavy, slid down her sides, gripping her hips to lift her body closer to his, bridging the gap between them until the heat of their skin became an unbearable, throbbing friction. Every movement was a deliberate, slow-burning torment, a physical language that spoke of absolute ownership and a passion that defied the very laws of the city outside. If you are completely breathless, caught in the absolute, shimmering heat of this dark romance, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about how much you love the fierce, possessive bond between Acua and Kangdae, and share this video with everyone who craves a beautifully intense and addictive love story. A soft, discreet chime from the high-tech security console near the door broke the heavy silence of the studio. Kangdae didn't move immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Acua, his thumb gently tracing the full, swollen curve of her bottom lip. He let out a frustrated sigh, his muscular frame flexing as he reluctantly rolled off her, though he kept one hand resting on her thigh as if refusing to break the physical connection completely. He reached for the sleek tablet resting on the bedside table, his fingers tapping the screen to reveal the live security feed. The screen showed his primary lieutenant, a tall, stern man in a flawless gray suit, standing outside the double steel doors. He held a thick, leather-bound folder and a small, velvet-covered box. The lieutenant knew better than to ring the bell unless the news was of monumental importance. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. The anger that had hardened his face just moments ago melted into a dark, obsessive hunger as his gaze swept over her shivering form. He walked back to the bed, the silk robe sliding off his broad, heavy shoulders to pool on the floor, exposing his magnificent, ink-strewn body once more. The massive dragon on his chest seemed to stretch, its tail coiling around his hip as he climbed back onto the platform, his heavy, muscular frame casting a shadow that completely enveloped her. "Do not look at me with fear in your eyes, Acua," he growled softly, his voice a low, vibrating purr that resonated deep within her chest. He reached out, his thick, tattooed fingers wrapping around the edge of the velvet sheet she was clutching to her collarbones. With a slow, unyielding pull, he stripped the fabric away, exposing her breathtaking curves to the soft morning light. "No one is going to touch you. No one is going to find you. You are locked in my cage, and the only key belongs to me." Acua let out a soft, shuddering gasp as his hands settled onto her waist, his rough palms sliding over the smooth, sensitive skin of her hips. The heat radiating from his body was an immediate, overwhelming force, making her entire frame throb with a desperate, aching need. She reached up, her hands tangling in his dark, messy hair, pulling his face down to hers. "I'm not afraid of them, Kangdae," she whimpered against his lips, her body naturally arching up to meet his solid, heavy warmth. "I'm afraid of how much I want this. I'm afraid of how completely you have ruined me." He let out a low, victorious groan, his mouth slamming down onto hers with a fierce, demanding passion that completely wiped out her ability to think. It was a kiss born of pure, unadulterated dominance, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting of raw desire and victory. Acua writhed beneath him, her fingers digging into the hard, flexing muscles of his back, feeling the intricate raised lines of his tattoos beneath her palms. He shifted his weight, pinning her flat against the soft velvet, his thick, heavily tattooed thighs parting hers, locking them together in a suffocatingly tight, heat-drenched embrace. The friction between their bodies was an unbearable liquid fire. Every slide of his chest against her bare breasts, every heavy press of his hips against hers, sent waves of pure, electric ecstasy straight to her core. She was panting, her head tossing from side to side on the pillows, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he worked his hands down her body. He traced the sweeping line of her outer thigh, his fingers digging into her soft flesh with a bruising, possessive grip that left no doubt about who owned her. He was molding her body just as they had molded the clay, shaping her surrendering form to fit perfectly against his rugged, hypermasculine frame. If your heart is pounding and you are completely locked in the fiery, high-stakes orbit of this forbidden passion, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about how deeply Kangdae's possessive love has consumed you, and share this story with everyone who craves a breathless, dangerously seductive escape. He broke the kiss, trailing his lips down the sensitive column of her throat, his teeth grazing her collarbone with a playful, tormenting pressure that made her cry out. Her hands slid down his back, gripping his tight, muscular buttocks, pulling him closer, begging for the friction to stop being a tease and become a complete, obliterating reality. She wanted to be consumed by him, to have his name, his ink, his very essence stamped into her skin until there was no distinction between the sculptress and the air. "Tell me what you want, Acua," Kangdae whispered, his breath hot and ragged against her breast, his hands sliding down between their bodies to stroke the sensitive skin of her inner thigh. "Tell me how deep you want to sink into my world." "All the way," she cried out, her voice a breathless, submissive plea as she locked her legs around his waist, pulling his heavy hips flush against hers. "Make me yours, Kangdae. Don't ever let me go." He didn't hesitate. With a powerful, deliberate movement, he claimed her completely, driving them both into a storm of pure, obsessive pleasure that defied the very boundaries of the room. The rhythm was heavy, primal, and utterly intoxicating. A chaotic symphony of soft moans, shifting velvet, and the heavy, synchronized gasps of two souls completely lost in their own beautiful ruin. In the quiet lavender light of the soul morning, surrounded by the remnants of their artistic war, the Ghanaian sculptress and her dangerous captor became a single, unbreakable masterpiece of desire. The golden warmth of the mid-morning sun now flooded the room, turning the lingering haze of their passion into a shimmering, dreamlike mist. Acua lay draped across Kangdae's massive, rising and falling chest, her fingers tracing the intricate, dark ink of the dragon that stretched across his collarbone. Her mahogany skin looked incredibly radiant against the pale, hard-carved muscle of his body, a striking contrast of light and shadow that seemed to belong in a museum of modern masterpieces. Kangdae's eyes were closed, his breathing deep and slow, but his arm remained locked around her waist with a tight, possessive grip that left no room for escape. She leaned up slightly, her chin resting on his chest, her full lips parting as she studied the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. Even in repose, there was a dangerous, lethal aura that clung to him, a silent promise that he could destroy anyone who dared to threaten what was his. As if sensing her gaze, his long eyelashes fluttered open, his dark, obsidian eyes instantly locking onto hers with a warmth that was entirely reserved for her. "What are you looking at, my little sculptress?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a sweet, familiar shiver straight to her core. "Your tattoos," she whispered, her thumb tracing the winding tail of the tiger on his forearm. "They're beautiful, but they look like they carry so much pain. Every line feels like a scar." Kangdae's gaze softened, a rare, vulnerable expression crossing his face as he reached up to gently cup her jaw. His thick, callous thumb rubbed against her soft cheek, his touch so tender it made her eyes flutter shut in pure bliss. "They are scars, Acua. In my world, you don't survive without carrying the ink of your battles. This tiger, it represents the night I took the leadership of the family after my brother was betrayed. I swore that I would never let anyone I care about be hurt again. And now that promise belongs to you." The sheer weight of his confession made her heart swell with an intense, addictive devotion. She pressed her face into his palm, inhaling the rich scent of his skin, sandalwood, rain, and the unmistakable, intoxicating musk of their shared passion. She was no longer just a girl who had been entrapped by soul's most dangerous air. She was the very center of his universe, the only soft thing in his cold, violent world. If you are completely captivated by this breathless, high-stakes surrender and want to see just how far Kangdae will go to protect his beautiful muse, take a quick second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment with your thoughts on their deep connection, and share the story with everyone who loves a dangerously passionate romance. Kangdae sat up slowly, bringing her with him so that she was sitting on his lap, her legs wrapping around his waist. He reached over to the nightstand and picked up a heavy, black velvet box that his lieutenant had delivered earlier. He placed it in her hands, his eyes burning with a dark, expectant fire. "Open it," he commanded softly. With trembling fingers, Acua lifted the lid. Resting inside on a bed of white silk was a stunning, heavy ring carved entirely from black obsidian, polished to a mirror-like shine. Inset into the center was a flawless, deep red ruby that caught the morning light like a drop of fresh blood. "This is the seal of my family," Kangdae whispered, his lips brushing against her neck, sending a fresh wave of heat pooling in her lower belly. "In the underworld of this city, this ring is more powerful than any weapon. Wear it, Acua. Let everyone who sees your hands know that you are untouched, untouchable, and completely mine." He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her middle finger. The cool stone felt heavy and powerful against her skin, a physical symbol of the gilded cage she had so willingly stepped into. She looked from the ring to his eyes, her breath catching as he pulled her closer, his lips parting as he prepared to claim her mouth once more, ready to lose himself in the sweet, intoxicating warmth of her body. Acua stared at the deep red ruby, its crimson depth reflecting the fiery, untamed devotion in Kangdae's eyes. She felt the cool weight of his legacy wrapping around her finger, sealing her fate as the queen of his dangerous empire. The transition from a simple artist to his ultimate, breathless obsession was complete, and she had never felt a more exhilarating rush. Kangdae didn't give her another second to think, his heavy, muscular frame pressing her back down into the plush crimson velvet of the bed. His lips met hers with a fierce, possessive finality, a breathless kiss that tasted of sweet victory and unconditional surrender. His tattooed hands, rough and commanding, slid down her sides, pulling her hips flush against his rock-hard thighs, locking them in an embrace that defied the entire world outside. She gasped into his mouth, completely ruined by his touch, her fingers digging into the powerful muscles of his back, tracing the raised ink of the dragon that now guarded her soul. As the morning sun fully illuminated the studio, casting a golden halo over the completed sculpture of the fallen angel, Acua knew she was no longer just his captive. She was his equal, his muse, and his eternal addiction. Locked in the devastating, pleasure-driven orbit of his arms, the Ghanaian sculptress surrendered completely to the dangerous air, their bodies and souls forever molded together into a single, breathtaking masterpiece of raw, obsessive love. If you are completely breathless after witnessing this ultimate, fiery surrender, make sure to show your love by subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button,